Let's dive right into this explainer. Picture this, it's 1869, and Roman Catholic bishops have gathered for the First Vatican Council. This was a truly historic event where theology literally collided with real-world politics. Today, we're unpacking the history of that council, the intense internal debates it sparked, and the specific scriptural critiques raised by our source material regarding its final outcome. Let's get started.
We've got a clear roadmap for today. First, inside Vatican I. Second, defining papal infallibility. Third, the internal pushback. Fourth, the biblical counterargument. And finally, interrupted by earthly war.
Section 1. Inside Vatican I, convoking the council.
Let's put this into perspective. This timeline reveals a surprisingly brief yet chaotic window for the council. Back in 1854, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was introduced. Fast forward a bit to 1869, and Pope Pius IX convokes Vatican I, bringing roughly 700 bishops all the way to Rome. But get this, just 1 year later, Rome is captured, and the council is abruptly suspended indefinitely. What happened in that single volatile year was absolutely monumental.
To really understand the council's central debate, the source notes we first have to look at the Church's strict hierarchy. Think of it kind of like a pyramid. Operating under the Pope are lesser bishops who oversee local synods. The Catholic Church models this specific chain of command on the original apostles, and they view Peter as the undisputed template for the Pope.
Section 2. Defining papal infallibility, the core issue.
So what exactly is papal infallibility? Well, it means the Pope is preserved free from error when he teaches definitively on a doctrine concerning faith or morals. Now, the source notes this wasn't a brand new idea springing up out of nowhere in 1869. Past popes had actually utilized this authority before, but Vatican I sought to elevate this tradition into official, unquestionable church dogma, and that is a huge shift. But if approved, this dogma came with a very strict condition. The Pope is only considered infallible when speaking ex cathedra. That's a Latin term referring to the official, authoritative capacity of the papal office. So it doesn't mean everything he says in passing is infallible. It applies strictly when he acts in his supreme official capacity to define a doctrine for the Church.
The formal acknowledgement by the Council granted Pope Pius IX exactly what is described here: full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the whole Church. This centralized authority to an unprecedented degree. It basically meant the Pope alone could decide and define tradition, completely without the collective agreement of the bishops.
Section 3. The internal pushback, a divided council.
Now, you might think a room full of 700 bishops would be completely united on this, right? Well, actually, the road to this declaration was highly contested. They were definitely not a monolith. Only a minor contingent questioned the core theology of infallibility itself. The real friction came from a much larger group who strongly resisted making it official dogma. They argued fiercely against codifying it as a binding rule for everyone.
This internal pushback was driven by three really specific concerns. First up, there was a real fear of alienating adherents who saw this as a massive departure from early Christian teachings. Second, they had a strong desire to protect church unity against this kind of absolute top-down authority. And third, there was a deeply held belief that bishops were actually meant to act as a collective governing body, rather than having just one figurehead dictate tradition all by himself.
This intense internal debate over authority perfectly sets the stage for the source material's direct theological critique of the Vatican. It really makes us ask, but does this Catholic hierarchy actually have a biblical model?
Section 4. The biblical counterargument, a scriptural critique. The source firmly argues that this hierarchical structure just doesn't have a biblical foundation. We can actually contrast the two models directly. On one side, the Catholic hierarchy relies on the Pope as the head, based entirely on apostolic succession from Peter. But on the flip side, the source argues the scriptural model declares Christ himself as the head, and that it contains absolutely no mandate for the creation of a papal office whatsoever.
According to the provided text, the concept of apostolic succession through an unbroken line from Peter is entirely unbiblical. The source points straight to the books of Ephesians and Colossians, which declare Christ as the sole head of the Church. Furthermore, the author notes that Scripture never even intimates that Peter actually ruled over the other apostles. So they argue there is zero biblical reason to assert an infallible papal office.
Section 5. Interrupted by earthly war, the council's abrupt end.
Ultimately, the conclusion of Vatican I wasn't dictated by some grand theological consensus. It was dictated by raw earthly politics. Out of nowhere, The outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War violently interrupted the proceedings, forcing them to just postpone several planned topics. Then, in 1870, Rome was captured by the Kingdom of Italy. The political map was completely redrawn, and this massive historic religious council was suspended indefinitely. Just like that.
This sudden, chaotic end leads the author to a really striking conclusion, that the underlying purpose of Vatican I was actually largely political. The source points out the profound irony of the whole event. They view the Vatican's maneuvers, trying to consolidate ultimate authority into one single figurehead, as a reflection of its status as a political power rather than a purely spiritual one.
The text underscores this critique by using the words of Jesus to highlight a pretty stark contrast. By quoting John chapter 18, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world," the source draws a super sharp line between the earthly power grabs of 19th century Europe and the spiritual kingdom described in the Bible. The logic of the source material highlights the ultimate irony of Vatican I. Think about it. An infallible divine decree regarding supreme spiritual authority was quite literally halted by human borders and earthly conflict. It leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder. Can a supreme spiritual agenda truly be interrupted and postponed by a human war?